June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The air filled with the metallic rattle that soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw, the MG42 machine gun that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. Private First Class Thomas Walden dove behind a shattered seawall as bullets tore through the sand inches from his head. Within moments, he would make a decision that military historians would later study in academies around the world. The MG42 nest had pinned down over 40 Allied soldiers on that blood-soaked stretch of beach. What happened next would redefine the very concept of battlefield improvisation and prove that sometimes the most ordinary men could perform the most extraordinary feats of courage. The morning had begun with the violent pitch and roll of landing craft approaching Omaha Beach. Thomas Walden, a 22-year-old former factory worker from Cincinnati, Ohio, had enlisted after Pearl Harbor like thousands of other Americans. He had never imagined that his mechanical aptitude would soon be tested not in fixing engines, but in understanding how to neutralize one of Germany's most fearsome weapons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The assault waves had started at 6:30 a.m. under cloudy skies. German defenses were far more formidable than Allied intelligence had indicated. Beach obstacles laced with mines awaited the landing craft. Artillery had been pre-sighted on the approaches, and worst of all, dozens of concrete bunkers housing MG42 machine guns created interlocking fields of fire that turned the shoreline into a killing zone. The MG42, nicknamed Bone Saw by German troops and Hitler's Zipper by the Allies, represented a quantum leap in infantry weapons. Its distinctive sound, a ripping canvas noise rather than the slower pop, pop, pop of other machine guns, struck terror into Allied soldiers. The weapon could fire 20 rounds per second, twice the rate of anything the Allies fielded. Its barrel could be changed in seconds when it overheated, allowing for sustained fire. Most terrifying of all was its psychological effect. The sheer volume of bullets made men freeze in place or panic, often leading to fatal mistakes. Thomas had studied the weapon extensively during training in England. While other soldiers played cards or wrote letters home, Thomas had spent hours with the few captured MG42s available to Allied forces, taking them apart, understanding their mechanics. His sergeant had mocked this obsession, saying, "Walden, knowing how the damn thing works won't help when it's shooting at you." On June 6th, that knowledge would prove more valuable than anyone could have predicted. The landing craft carrying Thomas and 30 other men from the 29th Infantry Division hit a sandbar 300 yards from shore. The ramp dropped and immediately German machine gun fire raked the boat. The first men were cut down before they could even move. The water around the craft turned red with blood. "Over the sides!" the lieutenant shouted before a burst of fire caught him in the chest. Thomas plunged into the water, his 80 pounds of equipment threatening to drag him under. The sea was chest deep, and he struggled forward as bullets created a pattern of small geysers around him. Men fell everywhere. His best friend from basic training, Private James Littman, disappeared beneath the waves just 10 feet from him. The cold shock of the water had cleared Thomas's mind of fear. Over the next hour, Thomas detailed his observations about the German gun and its operators. The weapon's extreme rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, meant barrel overheating was a constant concern. Its accuracy decreased significantly after about 150 rounds of continuous fire, as the barrel expanded from heat. The distinctive sound signature made it easy to locate. And while its lateral traverse was exceptional, its elevation limitations created blind spots that could be exploited. "The Germans know these weaknesses," Thomas explained. "That's why they position multiple guns to cover each other's vulnerabilities. But if we can isolate individual positions and approach them from their specific blind spots, we can neutralize them one by one." Sergeant Hayes, who had fought alongside Thomas on the beach, added, "I watched him do it today, sir. He timed the barrel changes perfectly, knew exactly when they'd stop firing." As the briefing continued, more officers crowded into the small room. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Anderson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, arrived shortly before midnight and listened intently as Thomas outlined his proposed tactics. "You realize what you're suggesting goes against standard infantry doctrine," Anderson said when Thomas finished. "Yes, sir. But standard doctrine wasn't developed with the MG42 in mind. This weapon changes the equation. Anderson studied Thomas thoughtfully. How old are you, son? 22, sir. And you're a civilian occupation? Factory worker at the Cincinnati mechanics plant. I assembled engine components for heavy machinery. The colonel nodded slowly. That explains your mechanical aptitude. Very well, Walden. I'm authorizing the formation of specialized counter-MG teams under Captain Reynolds' command. You'll train them in your methods, starting tomorrow. Thomas was stunned. He had expected to be heard, perhaps even to have some of his ideas implemented, but not to be placed in such a position of responsibility. Sir, I'm just a PFC. Shouldn't an officer or senior NCO? War makes its own hierarchy, son. Right now, you know more about neutralizing these guns than anyone else in this battalion. Rank be damned. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep despite his exhaustion. He lay on the hard floor of the farmhouse, replaying the day's events in his mind. The horror of the beach landing, the terrifying sprint toward the German bunker, the moment he had turned the captured MG42 against its former owners. But mostly he thought about James Littman, his friend who had disappeared beneath the waves before even reaching shore. You awake? It was Sergeant Hayes, his bulk barely visible in the darkness. Yes, Sergeant. You did good today, real good. But tomorrow's going to be harder, you know that, right? Thomas stared at the ceiling. Because of the terrain? Partly. Those hedgerows are perfect for defensive positions. But that's not what I mean. Hayes paused. Tomorrow you'll be responsible for other men who will follow your ideas into combat. When it was just us charging that bunker, you were only risking our lives. Now you'll be risking others. The weight of that responsibility settled over Thomas like a physical presence. I know. Can you handle that? Thomas thought about the bodies on the beach, the men who had died because no one knew how to counter the German guns effectively. I have to, he said simply. Too many will die otherwise. Dawn brought a light drizzle and the rumble of distant artillery. While the main force prepared for the day's advance, Thomas gathered his newly formed team in a small orchard behind the farmhouse. 20 men stood before him, volunteers from various units who had either witnessed his actions on the beach or heard about them. The MG42 has earned its fearsome reputation, but understanding it is the first step to defeating it. For the next hour, he explained the weapon's mechanics, its tactical employment, and, most importantly, its vulnerabilities. He demonstrated the barrel change procedure, showing exactly how long it took and what visual cues indicated it was about to happen. The sound is your best indicator, he explained. When you hear the rate of fire becoming slightly irregular, a subtle stutter in the rhythm, that means the barrel is approaching critical temperature. They'll need to change it within seconds. Private Robert Jenkins, a former hunting guide from Montana, asked, "Can't we just shoot the gunners through the firing slit?" Occasionally, yes, but the slits are narrow and the guns are usually positioned to make that extremely difficult. Our approach needs to be more methodical. Thomas divided the men into 4-person teams, each assigned to target specific MG42 positions that had been identified. Each team would have a designated observer who would track the gun's firing pattern, a navigator who would plot the approach route through blind spots, and 2 assault specialists who would carry the explosives needed to neutralize the emplacement. By mid-morning, they were ready. The battalion's advance would begin with an artillery barrage followed by a general infantry push. Thomas's specialized teams would move ahead of the main force, targeting the machine gun positions that would otherwise inflict devastating casualties. Captain Reynolds pulled Thomas aside before they moved out. "I'm placing a lot of trust in you, Walden. These tactics are unorthodox, but if they work, we'll save a lot of lives." Thomas nodded, feeling the enormous pressure of the moment. "We'll do our best, sir." "I know you will. One more thing. I'm recommending you for a battlefield commission. If we get through today, you'll be wearing lieutenant's bars by tomorrow." Before Thomas could respond, the artillery barrage began. Shells whistled overhead, impacting the German positions with thunderous explosions. Smoke and dust rose above the hedgerows as the ground trembled beneath their feet. When the barrage lifted, Thomas led his team forward. They moved cautiously through a narrow sunken lane, staying below the line of sight of the German positions. The MG42s opened up almost immediately, their distinctive sound echoing across the battlefield as they engaged the main Allied advance. Thomas had memorized the terrain from aerial photographs. He knew exactly where the first machine gun nest should be, a fortified position at the junction of two hedgerows covering a crucial approach to the village of Collevel-sur-Mer. "Listen," he whispered to his team as they crouched in a drainage ditch. The German gun was firing in long, sustained bursts, the gunner clearly trying to break up the American advance. Thomas closed his eyes, focusing entirely on the sound. Approaching overheat. Stand by. The gun's rhythm changed subtly, a minute hesitation between bursts. Moving in 10 seconds, they'll change barrels now. The distinctive sound stopped. Thomas and his team burst from cover, sprinting toward the hedgerow from an oblique angle. They covered 30 yards before diving into a shell crater as the gun resumed firing, its bullets passing harmlessly overhead. "100 yards to target," Thomas said, checking his compass. "Next barrel change should come faster. They fired too long on that last sequence." Sure enough, barely a minute later, the gun fell silent again. They made another sprint, reaching the base of the hedgerow itself. Now they were in the MG42's blind spot, too close and at too steep an angle for the gun to depress enough to hit them. Private Cooper, who had been with Thomas since the beach landing, removed a satchel charge from his pack. "Ready when you are," he whispered. Thomas nodded. "Remember, throw it directly into the emplacement if possible. Don't try to be a hero." Cooper took a deep breath, then scrambled up the earthen bank of the hedgerow. Thomas and the others provided covering fire, aiming at the German position to keep the gunners' heads down. Cooper reached the top, lobbed the satchel charge into the gun emplacement, then rolled back down the slope. The explosion was deafening. Earth, debris, and smoke erupted from the German position. Thomas led the team over the hedgerow, rifles ready. They found the emplacement destroyed, 2 German soldiers dead amid the wreckage, and the MG42 damaged beyond use. "First one down," Thomas said, using his radio to report their success. "Moving to target 2. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, Thomas's teams methodically neutralized one German machine gun position after another. Each success made the next easier as they refined their tactics. By late afternoon, they had eliminated 8 MG42 nests, allowing the main infantry force to advance nearly a mile with minimal casualties. Not all attempts succeeded. The third team, led by Sergeant Davis, was caught in the open when they misjudged a barrel change timing. 2 men were wounded, and they had to fall back. The second team lost Private Williams when a German grenade landed in their midst as they approached an emplacement. But compared to the wholesale slaughter that had been expected, the casualties were remarkably light. Word spread quickly through the battalion that the MG hunters were making the impossible possible. Late in the day, Thomas's team approached their final target, a heavily reinforced bunker housing 2 MG42s that commanded a crucial road junction. Intelligence suggested this position was manned by SS troops rather than regular Wehrmacht soldiers, making it a particularly dangerous objective. "This one's different," Thomas told his team as they observed the position from 400 yards away, concealed in a bomb crater. Dual guns with staggered firing patterns. They're covering for each other during barrel changes. Private Jackson, a former mathematics teacher from Philadelphia, studied the firing pattern. "There's still a rhythm to it. If we time it right, there's a 3-second window when both guns might be changing barrels simultaneously." Thomas shook his head. "Too risky. We need another approach." He studied the terrain carefully. The bunker was well positioned, but a deep drainage ditch ran within 50 yards of its right flank. If they could reach the ditch unseen, they might approach close enough for a coordinated attack. As they plotted their approach, Captain Reynolds crawled up to their position. "Battalion needs that bunker neutralized in the next 30 minutes, he said grimly. "They're bringing up tanks, and this is the only viable approach. If those guns are still operational when the armor arrives, it'll be a slaughter." Thomas felt the pressure intensify. "We're working on it, sir, but this position is much stronger than the others." Reynolds handed him a pair of binoculars. "Take a closer look at the rear of the bunker." Thomas peered through the glasses, adjusting the focus. What he saw changed everything. An ammunition truck was parked just behind the bunker, partially concealed by camouflage netting. German soldiers were unloading crates of machine gun ammunition and carrying them inside. "If we could hit that truck," Thomas began. "Exactly what I was thinking," Reynolds replied. "But our mortars don't have the accuracy, and artillery will take too long to adjust fire." Thomas looked back at the drainage ditch. "We can get close enough for rifle grenades, but we'll need a diversion to keep both guns occupied." The plan came together quickly. Captain Reynolds would lead a feint attack with a rifle platoon, drawing the attention of the MG42s. Meanwhile, Thomas and a small team would approach via the drainage ditch. Once in position, they would target the ammunition truck with rifle grenades, potentially setting off a catastrophic secondary explosion. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Reynolds moved his platoon into position. Thomas led Sergeant Hayes, Private Cooper, and Private Jackson through a series of shell craters toward the drainage ditch. The approach took nearly 20 minutes of painstaking movement, freezing in place whenever the German guns swept in their direction. When they finally reached the ditch, they were relieved to find it dry and deep enough to provide good cover. They moved quickly now, staying low, using the gathering darkness to mask their approach. Within 10 minutes, they had reached the closest point to the ammunition truck, about 60 yards away. Thomas attached a grenade to his rifle adapter while Hayes and Cooper did the same. Jackson would spot for them, helping adjust their aim. "Ready," Thomas radioed to Captain Reynolds. The diversionary attack began moments later. American rifles opened up from 300 yards away, concentrating fire on the bunker's firing slits. The German MG42s immediately responded, their tracer rounds cutting through the twilight in long, deadly streams. "Now," Thomas ordered. He fired his rifle grenade on a high arc, watching as it sailed toward the ammunition truck. Hayes and Cooper fired seconds later. All three grenades landed near the target, but only Hayes hit directly, detonating on impact. For a moment, nothing happened beyond the initial explosions. Then, suddenly, a blinding flash erupted as the ammunition began to cook off. Secondary explosions followed rapidly, each more powerful than the last. The camouflage netting caught fire, and within seconds the entire area behind the bunker was engulfed in flames. The most devastating explosion came moments later, likely the truck's fuel tank combined with a large quantity of ammunition. The blast was so powerful it partially collapsed the rear of the bunker. Both MG42s fell silent immediately. Thomas and his team didn't wait to see more. They retreated down the drainage ditch as German survivors from the bunker emerged, some on fire, others wounded and disoriented. Allied infantry rushed forward, securing the position and capturing 12 dazed prisoners. By nightfall, the battalion had achieved all its objectives for the day, advancing nearly 2 miles from their dawn starting positions. Casualties had been roughly 1/3 of what had been anticipated, largely thanks to Thomas's specialized teams and their success against the German machine guns. Colonel Anderson called a briefing at the new command post, a partially damaged but still functional church in Colavie-sur-Mer. Officers crowded into the nave, exhausted but buoyed by the day's success. "Gentlemen, we've made significant progress," Anderson began. "Our tactics against the MG42 positions have proven highly effective. I've already communicated these methods to adjacent units, and division headquarters is distributing a tactical memorandum based on Private Walden's approach." Thomas sat uncomfortably as all eyes turned toward him. He was filthy, exhausted, and still processing the day's events. The weight of leadership had proven heavier than he'd imagined. 2 men from his teams had died, 5 others were wounded. Even though their casualties were light compared to what might have been, each loss felt personal. After the briefing, Colonel Anderson approached Thomas with Captain Reynolds. "As promised," Anderson said, holding out a set of second lieutenant's bars. "Normally there'd be paperwork, ceremony, all that nonsense, but these are extraordinary times." Thomas stared at the insignia. "Sir, I'm not sure I deserve—" "It's not about deserving, son. It's about need. We need leaders who can adapt, who can solve problems others don't even recognize. You've demonstrated that ability." Anderson handed him the bars. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Walden."
That night, Thomas sat alone in the church's small garden, turning the lieutenant's bars over in his hands. The sounds of distant artillery fire punctuated the darkness, and the sky to the east occasionally lit up with flashes from naval gunfire supporting other landing areas. Sergeant Hayes found him there. "Not sleeping, Lieutenant?" he asked, emphasizing the new rank. Thomas smiled tiredly. "Still getting used to hearing that." Hayes sat beside him on a stone bench. "You earned it today. The men are talking about you, calling you the MG Hunter. Word spreading to other units, too. I just applied what I knew about the weapon. Anyone could have done it if they had studied it like I did. But they didn't. You did." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "My father fought in the last war. He told me that the German Maxim guns were the most terrifying thing he ever faced. Said men would freeze just hearing them. This generation has the MG42, even more lethal, even more terrifying. But you've taken away some of that terror. You've shown it can be beaten." Thomas thought about that. In the chaos of combat, he hadn't fully appreciated the psychological impact of their success. By demonstrating that the fearsome German guns could be systematically neutralized, they had done more than save lives. They had restored confidence. "Tomorrow will be harder," Thomas said. "The Germans will adapt, change their tactics. And so will we." Hayes stood and stretched. "Get some sleep, Lieutenant. Tomorrow's coming whether we're ready or not." As Hayes walked away, Thomas pinned the lieutenant's bars to his collar. From factory worker to infantry officer in less than a year, a transformation he never could have imagined when he enlisted. His obsession with understanding the mechanics of enemy weapons, once mocked by his fellow soldiers, had proven to be his greatest contribution to the war effort. He thought again of James Littman, who had died before even reaching the shore. "We made it inland, James. We're pushing 'em back." In the distance, a flare illuminated the sky, briefly revealing the shattered landscape of Normandy. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since landing that morning, Thomas allowed himself to believe they might actually win it. As he finally sought his own rest in a corner of the church, Thomas reflected on the strange twist of fate that had led him here. His mechanical aptitude, developed through years of factory work, had given him insight into the enemy's most fearsome weapon. That knowledge, combined with courage and initiative, had changed the course of at least one small part of the vast conflict engulfing the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adaptations required, new responsibilities of command. But tonight, he had helped prove that no weapon, however fearsome, was invincible when confronted with understanding, planning, and determined execution. Dawn broke over Normandy on June 8th, revealing a transformed landscape. Where pristine hedgerows and pastoral fields had once dominated, artillery craters, burning vehicles, and hastily dug fighting positions now scarred the terrain. The Allied beachhead had expanded significantly, but the Germans were regrouping, bringing in reinforcements from deeper in France. Lieutenant Thomas Walden woke before sunrise in the small chapel adjoining the church that served as battalion headquarters. His promotion had earned him a slightly more comfortable sleeping spot than most, though comfort was relative in the combat zone. His muscles ached from 2 days of intense physical exertion, and his uniform still bore the salt stains and blood stains from the beach landing. Captain Reynolds found him washing his face with water from his canteen. "Colonel Anderson wants to see you immediately," he said.
Division staff arrived an hour ago. Thomas followed Reynolds to the church's nave, where several officers he didn't recognize stood around a table covered with maps and aerial photographs. Colonel Anderson was deep in conversation with a brigadier general whose uniform bore the insignia of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. "Ah, here he is," Anderson said, gesturing Thomas forward. "General Williams, this is Lieutenant Walden, the officer I was telling you about." The general studied Thomas with piercing blue eyes. "So you're the young man who's been making my intelligence staff look bad." Thomas stood at attention. "Sir?" "At ease, Lieutenant. That wasn't a criticism." The general tapped the map. Your tactical innovations against the MG42 positions have accomplished in 2 days what our planners estimated would take a week and cost 3 times the casualties. Division wants your methods implemented across the entire front. Colonel Anderson added, "The General is here to discuss expanding your operation, Thomas." General Williams nodded. "I brought staff officers from 3 different divisions. We want you to brief them fully on your methods, then help establish similar specialized teams throughout the Allied forces. This is now our priority, direct from General Bradley himself." Thomas was stunned. Omar Bradley commanded the entire First Army, hundreds of thousands of men. The idea that his improvised tactics had reached such high levels of command was difficult to comprehend. "With respect, sir," Thomas said carefully, "I'm not certain my approach can be standardized so easily. Much depends on terrain, observation, and split-second timing." "That's precisely why we need you involved," Williams replied. "You demonstrated these principles in actual combat. You know what works and what doesn't. The staff officers can handle the organization and dissemination, but we need your practical expertise to ensure these aren't just theoretical concepts." Thomas looked at Colonel Anderson, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. "I'll do whatever I can to help, sir." "Excellent," Williams said. "We'll commence the briefing at 0900. Your current teams will continue their operations under Captain Reynolds, but you'll be temporarily assigned to divisional staff to oversee the training program." After the general left, Anderson placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "This is important work, son. The MG42 is perhaps the deadliest infantry weapon we've ever faced. If we can neutralize its effectiveness, we'll save thousands of lives." Thomas nodded, though his thoughts were already turning to the logistics of scaling up his approach. "Will my teams get replacements for the men we've lost?" "Already being arranged, and they'll receive priority for equipment, extra rifle grenades, smoke, and demolition charges." Anderson smiled slightly. "The quartermasters are suddenly very accommodating when Bradley's name is mentioned." The briefing began precisely at 0900. Thomas found himself facing a dozen staff officers from various units, all outranking him, all waiting expectantly for his expertise. 6 months earlier, he had been a factory worker who had never left Ohio. Now he was instructing West Point graduates and career military officers on combat tactics. He began with the fundamentals, the technical specifications of the MG42, its strengths and weaknesses, and the standard German doctrine for its employment. He explained how the weapon's extreme rate of fire created both advantages and vulnerabilities, particularly the need for frequent barrel changes. "The key insight," he explained, showing a diagram he had sketched, "is that these guns are almost never used in isolation. They're positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, covering each other's vulnerable periods during barrel changes. But this predictable pattern creates opportunities if you know what to look for."
Our standard doctrine for machine gun nests is to fix them with fire while flanking elements approach from the sides. Why isn't that sufficient? "Because the MG42 isn't the standard machine gun, sir," Thomas replied. "Its rate of fire is 2 to 3 times faster than our own 30 caliber weapons. Standard suppression tactics don't work effectively because you can't achieve fire superiority with rifles or even bars. And the Germans know this. They position multiple guns specifically to counter traditional flanking attempts." Thomas then detailed the specialized tactics his teams had developed, using terrain features to approach from oblique angles, timing movements to coincide with barrel changes, employing rifle grenades against ammunition supplies rather than the guns themselves, and using smoke to create artificial blind spots in the gun's fields of fire. Most importantly, he concluded, these aren't rigid procedures. Each position requires custom analysis and approaches. We've been most successful when team leaders are empowered to adapt tactics to the specific situation they face. The briefing extended well beyond its scheduled time, as officers asked detailed questions and debated implementation strategies. By early afternoon, a comprehensive training program had been developed. Thomas would oversee the initial training of team leaders from each division, who would then return to their units and establish their own specialized squads. As the meeting concluded, General Williams pulled Thomas aside. "Impressive work, Lieutenant. Where did you learn to analyze weapon systems so effectively?" "Cincinnati Mechanics Factory, sir. I worked in quality control for engine assemblies. My job was to identify failure points and mechanical weaknesses. Williams laughed. The Army has a knack for occasionally putting the right person in the right place, usually by complete accident. Report to division headquarters tomorrow morning. We'll have transportation arranged. That evening, Thomas visited his original team members who were preparing for the next day's operations. They had been reinforced with new volunteers and resupplied with ample ammunition and explosives. Sergeant Hayes greeted him with a salute that seemed only half ironic. "So, they're stealing our lieutenant already," Hayes said, after Thomas explained his new assignment. "I suppose that's how it goes. You come up with a good idea and they immediately pull you away from the fighting." "It's temporary," Thomas replied, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. "And it's important. If we can get these tactics distributed widely enough, it could change the entire campaign." Private Cooper, cleaning his rifle nearby, looked up. "Just make sure they understand it's not a mathematical formula, Lieutenant. The Germans adapt quickly. They're already changing how they position their guns based on what we did yesterday." Thomas nodded. "I've emphasized that point repeatedly. This isn't about rigid procedures. It's about understanding the weapon's limitations and exploiting them creatively." Hayes packed his pipe with the last of his tobacco. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow? We've identified 3 more MG42 positions covering the approach to St. Laurent." Thomas spread a map on an ammunition crate. For the next hour, they discussed terrain features, approach routes, and timing considerations for the coming day's operations. Despite his new assignment, Thomas remained deeply invested in the success of the teams he had created. As night fell and Thomas prepared to return to headquarters, Hayes walked with him part of the way. "The men have a pool going." "About what?" "About how high you'll rise before this war is over. Cooper says captain, Jackson thinks major. I've got my money on lieutenant colonel." Thomas laughed. "I've been an officer for all of 24 hours. "Maybe. But you've got something most officers lack. You solve problems instead of following procedures. That matters in this war." Hayes offered his hand. "Good luck with the brass, Lieutenant."
Try not to let them water down what works. The next morning, Thomas was transported to division headquarters, established in a small chateau 5 miles from the front. The contrast with the forward positions was stark. Staff officers in clean uniforms worked at proper desks. Radio operators maintained continuous communication with various units, and a fully equipped mess hall served hot food. It felt like a different world from the muddy, blood-soaked reality of the combat zone. For 3 days, Thomas worked with staff officers to develop standardized training materials. They created detailed diagrams, step-by-step procedures, and even a small handbook that could be distributed to infantry units. Thomas insisted on practical exercises, taking the staff officers into the field to demonstrate techniques firsthand. By the 4th day, the first wave of team leaders from various divisions arrived for training. Thomas found himself instructing sergeants and lieutenants, many older and more experienced than himself, in the art of neutralizing MG42 positions. Most were skeptical at first. The German gun had gained a fearsome reputation, but their doubts faded as Thomas walked them through actual case studies from his team's operations. Sergeant Frank Miller, a grizzled veteran from the 29th Infantry Division, summed up the general reaction. "We've been told these guns were unbeatable except with artillery or air support. You're showing us they can be defeated by small units using their brains instead of brute force. That's worth more than any pep talk from the brass." On June 15th, 9 days after D-Day, Thomas received unexpected news. General Bradley himself would be visiting division headquarters to observe the training program. The entire staff went into a frenzy of preparation. Maps were updated, facilities cleaned, and briefings rehearsed repeatedly. Bradley arrived with minimal fanfare, accompanied only by a small security detail and 2 staff officers. He observed a training session where Thomas demonstrated barrel change timing using a captured MG42, then reviewed the tactical manual that had been developed.
Afterwards, Bradley spoke privately with Thomas. "Lieutenant, your innovations have already saved many lives. Initial reports suggest a 40% reduction in casualties from machine gun fire in units employing your methods." "Thank you, sir. The credit belongs to the men implementing these tactics in the field. I just provided the framework." Bradley smiled slightly. "Modesty is admirable, but accuracy matters more. Good ideas are rare in warfare. When they emerge, they should be recognized." He paused. "I understand you were a factory worker before the war?" "Yes, sir. Quality control at Cincinnati Mechanics. I mention it because it illustrates an important point. The Army tends to think military problems require military solutions from military minds. Yet some of our most valuable innovations have come from civilians applying their unique perspectives to battlefield challenges." Bradley straightened his jacket. "Keep up the good work, Lieutenant. Your contribution won't be forgotten." As June progressed into July, the specialized anti-MG42 teams became a standard feature in Allied infantry units across Normandy. Their success rate varied. Some units implemented the tactics effectively while others struggled, but the overall impact was undeniable. German machine gun positions that had once been considered nearly impregnable were being systematically neutralized, allowing Allied forces to advance more rapidly with fewer casualties. The Germans responded by adapting their defensive tactics. They began positioning MG42s in less predictable arrangements, adding dummy positions to confuse observers, and employing snipers specifically to target what they now recognized as specialized neutralization teams. These countermeasures created new challenges, requiring further tactical innovations.
Thomas worked constantly to refine the training program, incorporating lessons from the field and developing countermeasures to German adaptations. By mid-July, the Allies had consolidated their beachhead and were preparing for Operation Cobra, the major offensive to break out of Normandy. Thomas received orders to return to his original unit, now expanded and designated as the 2nd Battalion Special Tactics Company under Captain Reynolds. His return to the front coincided with a German counteroffensive aimed at pushing the Allies back to the sea. Near the village of Saint-Lô, Thomas's company found itself defending a critical road junction against elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division. The battle began at dawn on July 18th with a heavy artillery barrage followed by an infantry assault supported by MG42 teams. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. He was now facing the very weapon he had spent weeks teaching others how to defeat. But the knowledge worked both ways. Understanding exactly how the German guns would be employed allowed him to position his forces optimally, using the terrain to minimize exposure and creating killing zones where the MG42's fields of fire were most restricted. The battle raged for hours, with the Germans making repeated attempts to dislodge the American defenders. By mid-afternoon, ammunition was running low, and casualties had reduced Thomas's company to less than 70% effectiveness. "We need to pull back to the secondary position," Captain Reynolds shouted over the din of combat. "We can't hold here much longer." Thomas studied the German deployments through his binoculars. "They're bringing up more machine guns, but look at their positioning. They're clustering them too close together. If we can hit that concentration with artillery, we could break their attack entirely." Reynolds shook his head. "Artillery's been redirected to support the 4th Division. We're on our own." Thomas considered their options. Direct assault against the German position would be suicidal. Retreat meant surrendering a tactically vital crossroads. A third alternative began to form in his mind. Risky, but potentially decisive. "I need 6 volunteers," he said. "We're going to circle behind their position through that ravine to the east." Reynolds looked skeptical. "That's at least 800 yards through territory we don't control. What's the objective?" "Their ammunition supply," Thomas pointed to vehicles visible behind the German lines. "They've consolidated their MG42s, which means they've also consolidated their ammunition. One well-placed demolition charge could disable their entire machine gun group." It was the same principle Thomas had been teaching for weeks. Target the support elements rather than the guns themselves, but applied on a larger scale. Reynolds reluctantly approved the operation, though his expression made clear he considered it a long shot at best. Sergeant Hayes immediately volunteered, as did Privates Cooper and Jackson from the original beach landing team. 3 more experienced soldiers joined them: Staff Sergeant Wilson, Private First Class Rodriguez, and Private Adams. As the main company provided covering fire, Thomas led his small team eastward, using a drainage ditch for concealment until they reached the wooded ravine. They moved silently through the underbrush, freezing in place whenever German patrols passed nearby. The journey took nearly 2 hours, requiring painstaking navigation to avoid enemy positions. By late afternoon, they had reached a position directly behind the German lines. Less than 100 yards away, 3 trucks were parked under camouflage netting. German soldiers were unloading crates of ammunition and carrying them to the forward positions where 6 MG42s had been established in a semicircular pattern. "Perfect centralized supply point," Thomas whispered to Hayes. "They're violating their own doctrine to increase firepower concentration." Hayes nodded grimly. "If those trucks go up, they lose their sustained fire capability."
Thomas, Hayes, Cooper, and Jackson would approach the trucks from different directions, placing timed charges on all 3 vehicles. Adams would remain in reserve, ready to assist wherever needed. They waited until dusk, when the fading light would make detection more difficult while still allowing them to see their targets. On Thomas's signal, they moved forward, staying low and using every available bit of cover. Thomas approached the easternmost truck, a canvas-covered 3-ton vehicle stacked with wooden ammunition crates. He reached it without incident and quickly placed his demolition charge among the crates, setting the timer for 5 minutes. Looking to his right, he could see Hayes doing the same at the middle truck. Everything was proceeding according to plan until a German soldier emerged from behind the 3rd truck directly in front of Cooper. There was a moment of mutual surprise before the German raised his rifle and shouted an alarm. Cooper tackled him before he could fire, and the 2 men struggled on the ground. More Germans appeared, responding to the commotion. The element of surprise was lost. "Complete your objectives!" Thomas shouted. 2-minute timers! Wilson and Rodriguez opened fire from their position at the edge of the ravine, providing covering fire as Thomas reset his charge for a shorter detonation time. Hayes did the same, then both men sprinted toward Cooper's position to assist. The 3rd truck remained uncharted. Jackson had been hit in the initial exchange of fire and lay wounded behind a stack of fuel drums. Thomas reached Cooper, who had subdued his opponent but was now pinned down by fire from the German machine gun position. "We need to get out of here," Hayes shouted. "First charges blow in less than 2 minutes." Thomas looked at the 3rd truck, still loaded with ammunition. Without all 3 vehicles disabled, the operation would be only partially successful. The Germans would still have enough supply for several of their guns. "Get Cooper and Jackson back to the ravine," Thomas ordered. "I'll finish this." Hayes grabbed his arm. "That's suicide, Lieutenant." "Just be ready to cover me." Thomas checked his watch. 1 minute 30 until the first charges detonate. That should provide all the distraction I need. Before Hayes could protest further, Thomas removed the demolition charge from his pack and moved laterally away from the trucks, using the growing darkness to mask his movement. He circled wide, approaching the 3rd truck from the rear, where the German defensive fire was lightest. Hayes and the others provided covering fire, drawing attention away from Thomas's approach. German soldiers focused on the obvious threat, not noticing the lone figure slipping behind their position. Thomas reached the 3rd truck just as the first demolition charge detonated. The explosion was massive, far larger than anticipated. The entire 1st truck disintegrated, sending ammunition, shrapnel, and flames in all directions. The concussion knocked Thomas to the ground. The German position erupted in chaos. Soldiers ran in all directions, some toward the burning wreckage, others away from it. Thomas recovered quickly, placed his charge deep among the ammunition crates on the 3rd truck, and set the timer for 1 minute. As he turned to retreat, the 2nd charge detonated. This explosion triggered a chain reaction as hundreds of machine gun rounds cooked off simultaneously.
The night sky lit up with tracer rounds firing in all directions. Several Germans were cut down by their own ammunition. Thomas ran toward the ravine where Hayes and the others waited. He had covered half the distance when a stray round caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him down. The pain was immediate and intense, but adrenaline kept him moving. He struggled to his feet and continued running, his left arm hanging useless at his side. The third charge detonated just as Thomas reached the edge of the ravine. The explosion was even more spectacular than the previous two, sending a fireball 50 feet into the air. All 3 German ammunition trucks were now destroyed, along with their entire reserve of machine gun ammunition.
Hayes and Cooper pulled Thomas into the ravine's cover. Rodriguez quickly applied a field dressing to his shoulder wound. "Mission accomplished, Lieutenant," Hayes said, grinning despite the gravity of their situation. "German MG position is neutralized. Their guns are intact but useless without ammunition." Thomas nodded, fighting against the pain and blood loss. "We need to get back to our lines before they reorganize." The return journey was arduous. Thomas's wound made movement difficult, and they had to carry Jackson, whose leg had been badly damaged. It took them nearly 3 hours to reach American positions, moving slowly and avoiding German patrols sent to investigate the explosions. When they finally reached the American lines, they discovered the tactical situation had been transformed. Without sustained machine gun support, the German attack had faltered. American forces had not only held the crossroads, but it pushed forward, gaining nearly a kilometer of territory. Thomas was evacuated to a field hospital, where surgeons removed a German bullet and several fragments from his shoulder. The wound was serious but not life-threatening. He would recover full use of his arm given time and rehabilitation. While recovering, Thomas received word that his actions had earned him the Silver Star. More significantly, the tactics he had developed had been incorporated into official infantry doctrine across the Allied forces. Special anti-machine gun teams were now standard in every battalion, employing variations of the techniques Thomas had pioneered on Omaha Beach. On August 1st, as American forces prepared for the final push to break out of Normandy, General Bradley visited the field hospital. He spoke briefly with Thomas, confirming what many had already begun to say, that a factory worker's understanding of mechanical systems had changed how the Allied forces fought against Germany's most feared infantry weapon. "The greatest weapons are only as effective as our understanding of them," Bradley told Thomas. "You stripped away the MG42's mystique and showed it was just a machine with weaknesses like any other. That insight has saved countless lives." In September 1944, after recovering from his wound, Thomas was promoted to captain and given command of a special training unit teaching anti-machine gun tactics to replacement troops arriving in Europe. The units he trained would go on to fight through France, Belgium, and eventually into Germany itself, carrying with them the lessons first learned on Omaha Beach. By war's end, Thomas Walden had received multiple decorations, commanded hundreds of men, and established tactical doctrines that would influence military thinking for decades. Yet when asked years later about his most significant contribution, he would point to that first day on Omaha Beach, the moment when understanding a weapon's mechanical limitations had transformed it from an object of terror into a problem that could be solved. "Fear comes from what we don't understand," he would explain to military cadets long after the war. The MG42 was just a machine, a well-designed, lethal machine, but still bound by the laws of physics and mechanics. Once we understood how it worked, we could counter it effectively. His approach would become a fundamental principle in military education, that technological advantages are temporary, but adaptability and understanding are permanent advantages. The greatest weapon in warfare isn't a gun or a bomb or a tank. It's the human capacity to analyze, adapt, and overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges through intelligence and determination.
The legacy of those desperate days in Normandy lived on not just in military doctrine, but in the thousands of soldiers who returned home because one factory worker had looked at a fearsome weapon and seen not an unstoppable force, but a mechanical system with exploitable weaknesses. In that recognition lay the difference between defeat and victory, between despair and hope, between the beach and the world beyond.
Allied forces had liberated Paris, pushed through Belgium, and now stood at the German border itself. The war had entered a new phase, with many predicting Germany's imminent collapse. That optimism, however, proved premature. Thomas had spent September and October training replacement troops at a facility near Reims, France. His shoulder wound had healed well, though it still ached during cold weather. His experiences against the MG42 had been distilled into a comprehensive training program that had become standard throughout the Allied armies. On November 10th, Thomas received unexpected orders to report to SHAEF headquarters in Paris. The summons came without explanation, leaving him puzzled as he boarded a jeep for the 3-hour drive to the capital. Paris, despite occasional shortages, had regained much of its pre-war vibrancy. French civilians greeted American vehicles with waves and smiles. Children chased after them begging for chocolate, and cafes had reopened along the boulevards. SHAEF headquarters occupied the Hotel Trianon in Versailles, its ornate corridors now filled with staff officers, maps, and communication equipment. Thomas reported to the adjutant's desk, still uncertain why he had been called away from his training duties. "Captain Walden," a British colonel greeted him, "thank you for coming promptly. General Eisenhower would like to speak with you." Thomas's surprise must have shown on his face because the colonel smiled slightly. "Don't worry, Captain, it's not a court-martial." Thomas was led through a maze of offices until they reached a large conference room. Inside, a group of senior officers were gathered around a table covered with maps and reports. At the head of the table sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, studying a document through reading glasses. "Sir, Captain Walden has arrived," the colonel announced. Eisenhower looked up and removed his glasses. "Thank you, Colonel. Captain, please join us." Thomas took the indicated seat, acutely aware that he was the most junior officer in the room by several ranks. Besides Eisenhower, he recognized General Omar Bradley and several division commanders whose names he knew from briefings but had never met. "Captain, I've asked you here because we're facing a situation that may benefit from your particular expertise. Are you familiar with the Hurtgen Forest?" "Only by reputation, sir. It's a heavily wooded area on the German-Belgian border. I understand we've been fighting there since September." 3 months with minimal progress and heavy casualties, Eisenhower confirmed grimly. "The terrain heavily favors the defenders, and the Germans have had years to prepare their positions." General Bradley interjected, "The forest is approximately 50 square miles of dense woods, steep ravines, and limited roads. The Germans have converted it into a fortress with extensive bunker systems, pre-sighted artillery, and hundreds of machine gun positions." Thomas began to understand why he had been summoned. The MG42 would be particularly effective in such terrain. "Exactly," Eisenhower said. "In open country, our tanks and artillery give us overwhelming advantages. In the forest, those advantages disappear. The fighting becomes infantry against infantry, and the German machine guns are exacting a terrible toll. We're losing good men trying to advance through killing zones covered by weapons we can't effectively suppress." A major general whom Thomas didn't recognize spoke up. "The tactics you developed in Normandy have been partially implemented in Hurtgen, but with limited success. The terrain makes many of your approaches difficult or impossible to execute." Thomas considered this. "The core principles should still apply, sir, but they would need significant adaptation for forested terrain. The tactical situation is fundamentally different." "That's why you're here," Eisenhower said.
We need someone who understands both the weapon and the tactical principles at a fundamental level, not just as a set of procedures. Someone who can develop new approaches specifically for forest fighting.
Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. What exactly are you asking me to do, sir? Eisenhower exchanged glances with Bradley before answering. We're forming a special operations group to develop and test new tactics in the Hurtgen Forest. You will command this unit, with broad authority to select personnel and equipment. Your mission will be twofold: develop effective countermeasures against the German machine gun positions and train frontline units in these techniques. It was an extraordinary assignment for a captain only recently promoted. Thomas knew he should feel honored, but his primary emotion was concerned about the enormity of the task. How many men would I have, sir? Initially, a company-sized element, approximately 150 men. You can request specific individuals from any unit in the European theater, and you'll have priority for specialized equipment. Eisenhower leaned forward. I know it's an unusual assignment, Captain, but unusual problems require unusual solutions. Your work in Normandy demonstrated you have the analytical mind and tactical creativity this situation requires. Thomas thought carefully before responding. I'll need to study the terrain and German dispositions before proposing specific approaches, and I'll need officers and NCOs who can think adaptively rather than following rote procedures. All resources will be made available to you, Bradley assured him. Intelligence assessments, aerial photographs, prisoner interrogation reports, whatever you need. The meeting continued for another hour, with Thomas receiving detailed briefings on the situation in Hurtgen Forest. The picture that emerged was grim. Since September, 4 American divisions had attempted to secure the forest, suffering over 9,000 casualties while gaining only a few miles of territory. The dense woods neutralized American advantages in air power and armor while maximizing the effectiveness of German defensive weapons, particularly the MG42. By the meeting's end, Thomas had a clear mandate and the authority to execute it. He would establish a headquarters near the forest and immediately begin developing specialized tactics for the unique environment. Success would save thousands of lives and potentially break the stalemate on a critical section of the front. 3 days later, Thomas arrived at a former hunting lodge 6 miles behind the front lines near the Belgian town of Eupen. The stone building had been requisitioned as his command post, with adjacent buildings housing the troops assigned to his special operations group. Already the men he had requested were arriving, veterans from his Normandy teams, combat engineers with experience in demolitions, reconnaissance specialists, and a few German-speaking intelligence officers. Sergeant Hayes was among the first to report, having been transferred from a replacement depot in Liège. So, they've finally recognized your genius, Captain, he said with his characteristic dry humor as they shook hands. Or they're setting you up for a spectacular failure, hard to tell with the brass. Thomas smiled despite his tension. Good to see you too, Hayes. How's the leg? French doctors patched it up well enough. I won't be winning any races, but I can keep up with the younger men. Hayes glanced around at the bustling activity as more soldiers arrived. Word is you're forming some kind of a specialized unit. Something like that. We need to figure out how to neutralize German machine guns in dense forest terrain. Whistle. The Hurtgen meat grinder. I've heard stories from men rotating out of there. Not pretty. That's why we need to find better approaches. And I need experienced NCOs who understand what we're trying to accomplish. How about it, Sergeant? Ready for another round? Hayes nodded without hesitation. Wouldn't miss it, sir. Over the next week, Thomas assembled his team and immersed himself in studying the Hurtgen problem. He reviewed every available report, interviewed soldiers who had fought in the forest, and spent hours examining aerial photographs and terrain models. The fundamental challenge was clear. The tactics that had worked in Normandy's hedgerow country were largely ineffective in dense forest. The trees limited visibility to a few dozen yards at most. Fallen logs, thick undergrowth, and steep ravines channeled movement along predictable paths. German defenders had positioned their MG42s to cover these natural avenues of approach, creating killing zones that American troops couldn't avoid. "We need to rethink our basic assumptions," Thomas told his officers during a planning session. "In Normandy, we exploited the MG42's mechanical vulnerabilities, barrel changes, ammunition supply, limited elevation. In Hurtgen, we need to focus more on operational vulnerabilities, how the Germans employ these weapons within their defensive system." Lieutenant Robert Jenkins, a former forest ranger from Montana who had fought at Anzio, offered an insight. "The Germans aren't positioning their guns randomly. They're using the terrain to funnel our troops into predetermined kill zones. If we could somehow identify these zones before entering them." This observation became the foundation of their approach. Thomas's team developed techniques for identifying likely machine gun positions based on terrain analysis. They trained reconnaissance elements to detect subtle signs of German emplacements, trimmed branches that created fields of fire, disturbed ground from ammunition resupply, even slight discolorations on trees from muzzle blast. They also created specialized equipment for forest fighting. Engineers designed portable shields made from salvaged tank armor that could provide temporary cover in areas where natural cover was sparse. Snipers were equipped with special ammunition developed to penetrate the light armor shields the Germans sometimes used to protect their machine gunners. Most importantly, Thomas emphasized flexibility and adaptation. "The Germans will change their tactics once they recognize our approach," he told his team. "We need to be changing ours continuously as well." By early December, Thomas's Special Operations Group was ready for field testing. They moved to forward positions at the edge of the Hurtgen forest, preparing to implement their new tactics in actual combat conditions. The dense pine woods stretched before them like a dark wall, snowflakes beginning to dust the branches as winter set in. Their first operation targeted a German strongpoint that had repulsed 3 previous attacks. Intelligence indicated it was defended by at least 6 MG42 positions covering all approaches through a steep ravine. Thomas's plan departed radically from conventional tactics. Instead of a frontal assault, even with artillery support, he proposed a multi-day operation, beginning with extensive reconnaissance. Small 3-man teams infiltrated the German perimeter at night, mapping exact locations of machine gun positions, command bunkers, and ammunition storage. This intelligence-gathering phase lasted 3 nights, with teams gradually building a comprehensive picture of the German defenses. They discovered that while the machine gun positions themselves were well fortified, their ammunition supply routes were vulnerable, particularly where they crossed a small stream that bisected the German position. On the 4th night, Thomas led a 30-man assault team through a narrow gap in the German perimeter identified by the reconnaissance elements. They moved silently through the forest, using soft ground and fallen pine needles to muffle their footsteps. Their objective wasn't the machine gun positions themselves, but the ammunition bunker that supplied them. The assault succeeded beyond expectations. The assault team neutralized the ammunition bunker with minimal casualties, then withdrew before German reserves could respond. By morning, the previously formidable machine gun positions were rendered ineffective, their ammunition exhausted. American infantry secured the strongpoint with a fraction of the expected casualties. Word of the success spread quickly. Division and corps commanders requested similar operations in their sectors. Thomas's methods were showing results where conventional attacks had failed repeatedly. General Bradley visited the forest headquarters in mid-December to personally review the operations. "Your approach is unorthodox, Captain," he said, after examining the detailed after-action reports, "but the results speak for themselves. 7 key positions neutralized with fewer than 20 casualties. That's extraordinary efficiency." Thomas knew the praise was deserved, but remained focused on the challenges ahead. "We're still learning, sir. The Germans are already adapting, dispersing their ammunition storage, establishing secondary positions, using dummy emplacements to confuse our reconnaissance." Bradley nodded. "That's always the pattern. Action, reaction, counteraction.
The side that adapts faster usually prevails. He paused, looking at the large map of the forest that dominated one wall of the headquarters. We're planning a major push after the new year to finally clear the Hurtgen. Your methods will be central to the operation. What neither man knew was that events were already unfolding that would dramatically alter the situation. On December 16, 1944, just 2 days after Bradley's visit, the Germans launched their last major offensive of the war through the Ardennes forest, just south of the Hurtgen. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The surprise attack caught Allied forces unprepared. German armored divisions smashed through American lines, creating a massive bulge in the front. The situation became so critical that Thomas's Special Operations Group was immediately reassigned to help contain the breakthrough. Their specialized training in forest operations suddenly became invaluable in an entirely different context. Instead of methodically neutralizing fixed positions, they now needed to delay mobile German forces advancing through wooded terrain. Thomas quickly adapted their tactics. Small teams equipped with bazookas and demolition charges established ambush positions along forest roads and tracks that German armor would need to use. They targeted fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and command vehicles rather than the tanks themselves, applying the same principle of attacking support elements that had worked against static machine gun positions. The winter conditions were brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, snow accumulated to knee depth in many areas, and medical evacuation became nearly impossible in forward positions. Men suffered from trench foot, frostbite, and exhaustion as they maintained constant vigilance against German patrols and infiltrators. On December 22nd, Thomas's group was operating near the town of Butgenbach, a critical road junction that German forces were attempting to secure. Intelligence reported that an SS Panzer unit was moving through the forest toward American lines, attempting to bypass heavier defenses. Thomas led a mixed team of demolition experts and infantry to intercept this movement. They established positions along a narrow forest track that aerial reconnaissance had identified as the likely German approach route, setting charges and preparing ambush positions. Around midnight, the distinctive sound of German half-tracks and tanks reached their position. Thomas waited until the column was fully committed to the narrow track before giving the signal. Demolition charges exploded simultaneously at the front and rear of the column, disabling the lead and trail vehicles and trapping the remainder in between. What followed was a chaotic firefight in darkness and swirling snow. The Germans, caught by surprise, initially struggled to organize an effective response. Thomas's men, using their knowledge of forest warfare, engaged from multiple directions, creating confusion about their actual numbers and positions.
The German force, though superior in firepower, was constrained by the terrain and unable to bring their advantages to bear. After nearly an hour of intense fighting, they attempted to withdraw, abandoning several damaged vehicles. As dawn broke, Thomas assessed the results. His team had destroyed or disabled 7 German vehicles, including 2 Panzer IV tanks, and inflicted approximately 30 casualties while suffering only 3 wounded men themselves. More importantly, they had prevented a German breakthrough that might have threatened the entire defensive sector. Similar actions across the Ardennes gradually blunted the German offensive. By the end of December, the tide had turned. Allied reinforcements arrived in strength, and by mid-January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated, with German forces pushed back to their starting positions. The crisis of the bulge temporarily overshadowed the Hurtgen forest operations, but by February, attention returned to clearing this last significant German stronghold on the western approaches to the Rhine. Thomas's Special Operations Group, now expanded to battalion strength, resumed their original mission with enhanced authority and resources. The techniques they had developed before the German offensive were refined and expanded. They created a comprehensive manual for forest warfare that was distributed throughout the American divisions operating in the sector. Training teams worked directly with frontline units, teaching reconnaissance methods, ambush tactics, and specialized approaches to neutralizing machine gun positions in wooded terrain. By March 1945, The last German resistance in the Hurtgen forest had been overcome. The cost had been severe, nearly 33,000 American casualties over 6 months of fighting. But the specialized tactics developed by Thomas's group had significantly reduced losses in the final phases of the operation. As Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany, Thomas received new orders. He was being reassigned to Army headquarters to develop training programs for the anticipated fighting in Germany itself. His experiences in both Normandy and the Hurtgen had established him as one of the Army's foremost tactical innovators. Before leaving his command, Thomas gathered the core team that had been with him since the beginning. Sergeant Hayes, Lieutenant Jenkins, and the others had become more than colleagues. They were a brotherhood forged through shared danger and purpose. "What we've accomplished here goes beyond our specific mission," Thomas told them. "We've demonstrated that tactical problems require tactical solutions, not just overwhelming force. We've shown that understanding your enemy's systems, whether it's a machine gun or an entire defensive network, is the key to defeating them effectively." Hayes, never one for sentimentality, nevertheless spoke for the group. "You changed how the Army fights, Captain. Not many men can say that." Thomas shook his head. "We changed it together. The best ideas came from the men actually facing the guns." As Thomas prepared to depart for his new assignment, a courier arrived with orders and a small package. The orders promoted him to major, effective immediately. The package contained a silver star with oak leaf cluster, recognizing his actions during the Battle of the Bulge. More meaningful than these official recognitions, however, were the letters Thomas had begun receiving from soldiers across the front, men who had used his tactics and survived battles they might otherwise have lost. One letter from a sergeant in the 4th Infantry Division summed up the impact. "Before your training, we feared the MG42 like it was some kind of unstoppable monster. Now we see it as just another problem to solve. Thank you for showing us how." When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, Thomas was in Munich developing specialized urban combat techniques for the expected invasion of Japan. The news of German capitulation was received with muted celebration by men who knew another bloody campaign likely awaited them in the Pacific.
Those fears proved unnecessary when Japan surrendered in August following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war that had defined a generation was finally over. For Thomas Walden, who had traveled from the bloody shores of Normandy through the dark forests of Hurtgen to the ruined cities of Germany, it marked the end of an extraordinary journey. In the years after the war, Thomas's innovations became part of standard infantry doctrine. His analytical approach to tactical problems, identifying vulnerabilities in enemy systems and developing specific countermeasures, influenced military thinking far beyond the specific context of the MG42. When he finally returned to Cincinnati in late 1945, the factory worker who had left 3 years earlier was now a decorated major with multiple commendations. The quality control skills he had developed examining engine components had, through the strange alchemy of war, translated into tactical innovations that saved countless lives. Thomas often reflected on the irony that his greatest contribution came not from hatred of the enemy, but from respect for their engineering. By understanding the MG42 as a mechanical system with specific characteristics rather than as an object of fear, he had transformed how American forces approached one of the war's most significant tactical challenges. His story became a case study at military academies, illustrating how technical knowledge, analytical thinking, and tactical creativity could overcome seemingly insurmountable battlefield advantages. The lessons extended beyond the specific context of World War II, influencing approaches to subsequent conflicts where technological asymmetry created similar challenges. Perhaps most importantly, Thomas Walden's experience demonstrated that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. A factory worker's perspective had provided insights that traditional military thinking had missed.
His story reminded future generations of military leaders that effective solutions might come from anywhere, from the factory floor to the front lines, if leaders were willing to listen, adapt, and implement new ideas regardless of their origin. The man who had once been mocked for studying enemy weapons eventually changed how armies approach tactical problems, proving that understanding sometimes provides the greatest advantage of all in the chaotic environment of combat. His legacy lived on in military doctrine, training programs, and most importantly, in the lives of soldiers who returned home because someone had taken the time to truly understand the challenge they faced.